The cream envelope slid across the table, passing between the sweet potatoes and gravy before stopping at my hand like a sealed threat. My father did not yell. He simply stated in a painfully flat voice, "You have 10 days to leave your own house." The real shock was not the notice. It was the doorbell ringing just as my mother smiled, signaling that the night was about to turn against them. My name is Peyton Whitfield. I am 36 years old, and for the better part of the last decade, the historic carriage house in the heart of Old Louisville has been my anchor. It is a structure of weathered brick and deep, shadowed history, a place I had stubbornly dragged back into the light of the present. I did not just live in this house, I breathed life back into its neglected bones. As a project manager for Meridian Arc Preservation, a firm dedicated to architectural restoration, I knew the true value of mortar and wood. I had poured nearly every single bonus I ever earned from my job into this place. I spent countless evenings on my hands and knees, painstakingly sanding century-old hardwood floors until my joints ached. I spent thousands of dollars out of my own pocket to replace the rotting window frames with custom, historically accurate mahogany. It was my sanctuary. It was my masterpiece. Tonight, it was supposed to be a place of warmth. I had spent 3 days preparing for this Thanksgiving dinner. The dining room was bathed in the soft, golden glow of a vintage chandelier I had wired myself. The long, heavy oak table was set meticulously with silver that had taken me hours to polish. The air was thick with the rich, comforting aromas of roasted sage, browned butter, and baking apples. Yet, the atmosphere at the table was suffocating. My father, Reed Whitfield, sat at the head of the table like a judge presiding over a courtroom rather than a patriarch celebrating a holiday. He was a man composed entirely of sharp angles and sharper ambitions. He wore a tailored charcoal blazer, his posture rigid, his eyes calculating. He never relaxed. He only ever waited for his turn to move. To his right sat my mother, Lenora. She was the picture of pristine, Southern elegance, wearing a silk blouse and pearls that gleamed in the dim light. She adjusted her linen napkin with practiced, delicate fingers. Lenora possessed a terrifying talent. She could orchestrate absolute cruelty and make it look like routine. Polite family management. Across the table sat my younger sister, Brenna, and her husband, Wade Kessler. Brenna was swirling a half-empty glass of dark red wine. Her eyes were erratic, darting toward the walls, the turkey, her plate, everywhere except toward me. She was vibrating with a nervous, anticipatory energy. Beside her, Wade sat stiffly, his jaw clamped shut, cutting his turkey with a slow, mechanical rhythm that betrayed his deep discomfort. The silence in the room was unnatural. It was not the comfortable quiet of a family enjoying a meal. It was a heavy, breathless vacuum. It was the silence of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The strike came just as I was reaching for the silver serving spoon to offer a second helping of mashed potatoes. Reed reached inside the breast pocket of his blazer. He did not clear his throat to announce his intention. He did not offer a sigh of regret. With a terrifyingly calm, deliberate motion, he produced a thick, cream-colored legal envelope. He placed it onto the polished oak table and pushed it forward. The envelope slid with a faint, scratching friction. It glided past the cut crystal bowl of sweet potatoes. It passed the steaming silver gravy boat. It stopped exactly 1 inch from my right hand, resting there like a cleanly wrapped blade. I stared down at the blank cream paper. "What is this?" I asked. I forced my voice to remain steady, though a sudden, icy knot was already tightening in my stomach. "Open it, Peyton," Reed said. His voice lacked any trace of paternal warmth or even holiday tension. It was entirely flat. It was the exact, detached tone he used when finalizing a hostile corporate takeover. Lenora did not miss a single beat. She picked up her silver fork, collecting a small, precise portion of cranberry sauce. "It is just some paperwork, darling," she said, offering a serene, placid smile that did not reach her eyes. Her total lack of surprise was a sickening confirmation. They were in this together. "We are simply getting the estate affairs in proper order," It is certainly nothing to get emotional about during dinner. My fingers felt numb, detached from my body as I picked up the envelope. The paper stock was heavy, expensive, formal. I slid my thumb under the flap and broke the seal. Inside, I found a small stack of crisp, white legal documents. I unfolded them. At the very top of the first page, printed in bold, uncompromising black ink, were 3 devastating words: "Notice to vacate." My eyes scrambled across the dense blocks of legal jargon, desperately searching for context. But my brain seized upon the only facts that mattered. I had exactly 10 days to vacate the premises. The document explicitly claimed that the carriage house I was currently residing in was no longer mine, but was under the exclusive legal control of a corporate entity named Whitfield Family Holdings. 10 days, I whispered. The words felt like broken glass in my throat. I looked up, the warm, fragrant dining room suddenly feeling like a freezing cell. As I said, "It is merely a formality," Lenora chimed in, gently dabbing the corner of her mouth with her linen napkin. "But a necessary one. You must try to understand the broader picture." I sought out Brenna, desperately hoping my own sister would show a flicker of outrage or confusion. I needed someone to tell me this was an elaborate, cruel mistake. But Brenna still refused to meet my gaze. Instead, she turned her head and looked directly at Wade. A silent, deeply knowing glance passed between them. They did not look shocked. They did not look horrified. They looked profoundly relieved. They had known. They had been sitting here, eating my food, waiting for this exact moment to drop. "This is my house," I stated, my voice finally rising, shattering the carefully maintained, venomous civility of the dinner. "Mabel left this house to me. I have spent years of my life and thousands of dollars restoring it. I live here." Reed slowly set his heavy silver knife and fork down onto his porcelain plate. He steepled his fingers, leaning forward slightly to command the space. "Peyton, lower your voice immediately. This is not an emotional issue. This is a cold business reality. The family commercial venture is currently entirely stalled. We are facing a severe liquidity crisis that threatens everything. Liquidating this specific property is the only viable solution to save the broader family portfolio. You are evicting your own daughter on Thanksgiving to cover your failing investments," I asked, the sheer staggering audacity of the act suffocating me. "We are leveraging an underutilized asset," Reed corrected smoothly, entirely unfazed by my anger. "It is a carriage house. Peyton, it is not a legacy. It is dead equity. You will easily find an apartment. We will even generously cover your first 2 months of rent. But the title belongs to the holding company now, and the developers require vacant possession by the end of the month." My hands began to tremble as I looked back down at the stack of documents. The white-hot anger was quickly being swallowed by a much colder, much darker realization. Behind the formal notice to vacate, stapled neatly to the back, was a secondary packet of papers. I flipped the page over. It was a professional land survey. My breath caught in my chest. It was not merely a generic, publicly available plot map. It was a meticulously detailed, highly expensive topographical survey. It clearly outlined not just the structural footprint of my carriage house, but it detailed the exact square footage of the backyard. Even worse, it mapped out the narrow side alley that connected my property to the main commercial avenue. There were architectural sightlines drawn in bright red ink. There were utility access demarcations carefully noted in the margins. This was not a desperate, impulsive maneuver made by a proud man suddenly backed into a financial corner. A commercial survey of this magnitude and precision took weeks, perhaps even months, to secretly commission and execute. They had sent surveyors to walk the perimeter of my home while I was away at work. They had been actively, methodically plotting the dissection and sale of my only sanctuary while I was picking out the turkey we were currently eating. The betrayal was so absolute, so thoroughly calculated, that it transcended mere anger. It was a physical blow, a sudden, violent loss of oxygen. My own father, my own mother, my own sister. They had dressed up, sat at my table, drank my wine, and smiled across the table at me, knowing the entire time that they had a loaded legal weapon aimed straight at my back. I carefully placed the papers back onto the table. I smoothed my hands flat against the cool mahogany surface, feeling the rapid, frantic vibration of my own pulse against the wood. I forced my breathing to slow. I looked up, bypassing my mother's fake smile and my sister's cowardly avoidance, and looked directly into Reed's cold, calculating eyes. "By what right?" I demanded. My voice was no longer trembling. It dropped into a dangerous, quiet register that commanded the room. "By what legal right do you think you can take my home?" Reed slightly opened his mouth, drawing a breath, fully prepared to deliver a perfectly rehearsed, airtight legal justification to crush me. He never got the chance. Before he could form a single, arrogant syllable, the sharp, bright chime of my front doorbell rang out. The sound cut violently through the heavy, toxic atmosphere of the dining room. It was a sudden, piercing noise that severed the tension in the room like a second blade falling right onto the table. Every single head in the room snapped toward the hallway. The ringing of the doorbell hung in the air, a sharp contrast to the suffocating silence at the table, but my mind was entirely consumed by the heavy cream envelope resting near my hand. They thought this was merely a real estate transaction. They thought they were simply reallocating an asset. They did not understand what this carriage house actually was, or perhaps they simply did not care. This property did not fall into my lap through some stroke of blind luck or generational privilege. It was entrusted to me by my great-aunt Mabel Whitfield. Mabel was the undisputed matriarch of our fractured bloodline, a woman possessing a spine of absolute steel and a gaze that could strip the bark off a hickory tree. More importantly, she was the only person in the entire Whitfield family who possessed the clarity to see Reed exactly for what he was. She saw past the tailored suits and the aggressive business jargon. She saw the hollow, endless greed underneath. During the final 6 years of Mabel's life, as her health slowly deteriorated, the rest of the family conveniently disappeared. They were always too busy with golf tournaments, charity galas, or offshore investments to visit a dying old woman. I was the one who drove her to her countless cardiology appointments. I was the one who sat in the sterile waiting rooms for 6 hours at a time, holding her frail hand while they adjusted her medications. I was the one who navigated the labyrinth of municipal zoning offices to secure the proper historic permits when her roof began to cave in. When the ancient boiler finally gave out during the bitterest freeze of January 2018, my parents did not answer their phones. I was the one who drove through the ice storm, bought 4 space heaters, and slept on the freezing hardwood floor of her parlor to ensure she stayed warm while we waited 3 days for the repair crew. I earned every single square foot of this carriage house through sweat, loyalty, and actual love for decades. Reed had openly mocked the property. He constantly referred to the carriage house as dead equity. To a man who only understood the language of fast, liquid capital and aggressive market leverage, a century-old brick structure requiring constant maintenance was a financial anchor. He could not comprehend why Mabel refused to sell it and put the cash into one of his volatile holding funds. He underestimated the house, just as he underestimated me. Through my work as a project manager at Meridian Arc Preservation, I spent my days dealing with the legal and architectural intricacies of saving historic properties from aggressive commercial developers. I knew exactly what made a building structurally significant, and I knew the impenetrable armor that historic district zoning laws could provide. I understood the intrinsic and legal value of the hand-carved mahogany banisters, the original stained glass transoms, and the solid masonry walls far better than any spreadsheet analyst my father employed. The true friction regarding this house, however, began long before I moved in. The family never forgave Mabel for her independence. In their eyes, it was an unforgivable offense that a single, childless woman held the deed to the most beautiful, unencumbered piece of real estate left in the Whitfield name. The resentment crystallized into open warfare exactly 8 years ago. Mabel had just undergone a severe hip replacement surgery. She was 78 years old, confined to a hospital bed, and heavily medicated with strong narcotics. Reed saw an opportunity. He walked into her hospital room, flanked by a private notary he had hired. He brought a durable power of attorney document, completely drafted and ready for her signature. He tried to convince a woman who could barely keep her eyes open to sign away the total control of her medical and financial decisions directly to him. He thought she was too weak to resist. He was entirely wrong. Mabel might have been drugged, but her mind remained as sharp as broken glass. She recognized the trap instantly. She threw the clipboard at his chest and ordered him out of the room, loudly threatening to call the hospital security if he ever brought a legal document near her bed again. She never trusted him with a single piece of paper after that day, and that was exactly why she left the carriage house exclusively to me. She knew Reed would eventually try to rip it apart for parts. Now, sitting at the Thanksgiving table, staring at the commercial survey attached to the eviction notice, the entire puzzle locked together with sickening clarity, Reed had not suddenly decided he wanted dead equity. The entire neighborhood of Old Louisville had shifted over the past 2 years. The gritty, forgotten charm of the historic district had suddenly become a gold mine. Small, independent coffee shops were being replaced by high-end bistros. The dilapidated warehouses 2 streets over had been converted into luxury loft apartments selling for $700,000 a unit. More importantly, over the last 8 months, a quiet, aggressive buying spree had taken over my specific street. Anonymous limited liability companies had purchased the dry cleaner on the corner, the empty lot next to it, and the 2 rundown Victorian homes across the alleyway. I had watched the demolition crews move in. They were assembling a massive commercial footprint, but to do anything substantial, to rezone the block for something highly lucrative like a boutique hotel or a luxury retail complex, they needed contiguous property lines. They needed the alleyway access. They needed my carriage house. Without my exact parcel of land, the entire multi-million-dollar redevelopment project would stall completely. I looked at the perfectly manicured nails of my mother and the cowardly, averted eyes of my sister. My father's words echoed in my head. He had called it a severe liquidity crisis. But the eviction notice demanded I leave in exactly 10 days. This was not about a family trying to survive a tough fiscal quarter. This was about a hard, inflexible commercial deadline. The developers had likely given my father a strict ultimatum: deliver the final missing piece of the real property by the end of the month, or the entire buyout deal collapses. My father's own failing investments were probably entirely dependent on the massive payout from this specific land assembly. I was the final holdout. I was the one stubborn obstacle preventing a massive, faceless developer from bulldozing a century of history to build a sterile glass lobby. And my own flesh and blood had eagerly agreed to act as the executioners to secure their own financial bailout. They did not just want to evict me. They needed to erase me from the map to close their deal. The carriage house was not just a structure of brick and mortar. It was a living testament to survival. When I first took possession of it, the place smelled faintly of damp earth and neglect. The original gaslight fixtures had been violently ripped out decades prior, leaving jagged holes in the plaster. The grand, sweeping archway of the carriage doors had been poorly boarded up with cheap plywood that warped in the heavy summer humidity. I spent countless weekends stripping away the ugly, peeling layers of beige paint that some careless contractor had slapped over the original, intricately carved oak wainscoting. I remembered the exact, bone-deep exhaustion I felt after spending 14 straight hours reglazing the original leaded glass windows, ensuring every single pane was perfectly sealed against the incoming autumn storms. I sacrificed vacations, new clothes, and any semblance of a social life to fund the restoration. Every single time Meridian Arc Preservation handed me a performance bonus, it went directly into copper plumbing, slate roof tiles, or historically accurate brass hardware. Mabel had understood that level of devotion. She knew I would not view the property as a stepping stone or a quick flip. She knew I would treat it as a sacred trust. Reed, however, viewed the world through the cold, transactional lens of an aggressive hedge fund manager. A building only held value if it could be leveraged, mortgaged, or bulldozed for a higher density yield. The survey map attached to the eviction notice was the ultimate proof of his absolute emotional detachment. The red lines dissecting my beautiful blooming garden were drawn with total clinical precision. They had mapped out exactly where the heavy excavators would need to park. They had marked the precise location where my meticulously restored cobblestone pathway would be ripped up to lay commercial sewage pipes. They were not merely trying to throw me out into the cold. They were actively planning the physical murder of the home I had bled to save. The sheer mechanics of their plot were breathtakingly cruel. A 10-day notice to vacate meant they anticipated absolutely zero legal resistance. They assumed the sheer shock of a coordinated family ambush on Thanksgiving Day would paralyze me. They expected me to simply pack a suitcase, surrender my keys, and walk away sobbing, too heartbroken by the betrayal to hire a lawyer or contest the claim. They relied heavily on the ingrained, toxic dynamic where the daughter always yielded to the terrifying authority of the patriarch. But as I sat there, the initial wave of shock began to solidify into a dark, impenetrable resolve. I was not the terrified 20-year-old girl who used to flinch when Reed raised his voice over a spilled glass of milk. I was a professional who spent 40 hours a week battling aggressive corporate attorneys, corrupt zoning officials, and cutthroat developers who tried to destroy historic landmarks for a quick profit. I knew the exact statutes, the property codes, and the stalling tactics that could drag a simple eviction out for 18 grueling months. If they wanted a war over real estate, they had picked the absolute worst possible opponent. I kept my eyes fixed on the cream envelope, refusing to look at my father just yet. Let him think I was stunned. Let him believe his surgical strike had worked perfectly. The doorbell was still echoing in the hallway, a demanding summons that was about to rip the entire script right out of his arrogant hands. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the scent of the roasted sage and browned butter fill my lungs one last time before the impending explosion. The battle lines were clearly drawn, not in the dirt, but in fresh black ink and fraudulent legal claims. The chimes still echoed through the dining room, but I forced my attention back to the cream-colored pages beneath my trembling fingers. Someone would have to answer the door eventually, but in that stretched, suspended second, I ignored the interruption. I needed to understand the exact shape of the trap my father had sprung. I flipped past the glaring notice to vacate and dug into the dense, black-and-white legalese of the supporting documentation. I had assumed, in the initial blinding flash of betrayal, that Reed was attempting to challenge Mabel's will in probate court. I thought he was contesting my inheritance through some convoluted claim of undue influence. But my father was far too impatient for the grindingly slow wheels of probate. He did not want a protracted court battle. He wanted immediate, unquestionable ownership. My eyes scanned the header of the second page. It was a copy of a quitclaim deed. A quitclaim deed offered absolutely no warranties of title. It was the fastest, dirtiest way to legally transfer a property interest. The recording stamp from the county clerk's office was branded in the top right corner. The date of the recording was exactly 7 days ago. According to this piece of paper, Mabel had officially transferred the total ownership of the carriage house directly to Whitfield Family Holdings. The signature line at the bottom, however, did not bear my great-aunt's shaky, elegant cursive. It bore the sharp, aggressive scrawl of Reed Whitfield. Beneath his signature, typed in small, clinical letters, was the justification acting as attorney-in-fact under a durable power of attorney. A cold, sharp wave of absolute clarity washed over me. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. I remembered the exact afternoon Mabel had revoked that specific power of attorney. It was a sweltering Tuesday in July, 6 years ago. Reed had attempted to use that very same document to freeze an escrow account Mabel had set up to pay a team of masonry contractors. He had deemed the structural repairs a waste of capital and tried to starve the workers out to force her to sell. Mabel had been furious. She hired an independent lawyer the very next morning, formally revoked the power of attorney, and had the revocation notarized and filed with the county. That document was dead. It had been legally dead for over half a decade. Yet here was my father, casually resurrecting a voided legal instrument to essentially steal a piece of real estate out from under a deceased woman and his own daughter. He was banking entirely on the assumption that I did not know the intricate history of Mabel's legal affairs, or worse, that I would be too intimidated to verify the trail of paperwork. "You have precisely 10 days to clear your personal belongings from the premises," Reed stated, his voice cutting through my thoughts. He leaned back in his mahogany chair, adopting the relaxed, untouchable posture of a man who had already won the negotiation. "If you choose to be difficult about this, Peyton, I will not hesitate to secure the premises by force. We will bring in contractors. We will change the locks. We will take possession of the structure immediately. If you attempt to drag this into a courtroom, my legal team will bury you in injunctions. We will drive the dispute costs so exceptionally high that you will be bankrupt before you even secure a preliminary hearing." He was trying to suffocate me with procedure. He was using the sheer, terrifying weight of his corporate resources to crush any thought of resistance before it could even form in my mind. He wanted me to feel entirely isolated, surrounded by legal walls that I could not afford to climb. "We are doing this for the collective good of the family, darling," Lenora added. Her voice was spun sugar hiding a razor blade. She reached across the table, offering a perfectly manicured hand that I refused to take. "Do not make this an ugly, drawn-out affair. Just accept the transition gracefully. Once the commercial deal is fully finalized and the holding company is liquid again, your father and I will ensure you are properly compensated. We will buy you a beautiful little condominium. Something much more manageable for a single woman." The condescension was almost as nauseating as the fraud. They were offering to buy me a cheap cage with the stolen profits of my own sanctuary, framing their absolute theft as an act of maternal generosity. "It is just a pile of old bricks, Peyton," Brenna chimed in. Her voice lacked any of our mother's fake warmth. It was flat, annoyed, and entirely self-centered. She finally looked at me, her eyes hardened with resentment. "You are being entirely selfish. That old house is absolutely not worth destroying the financial future of this entire family. Wade and I have plans. We cannot have everything fall apart just because you have an unhealthy emotional attachment to a drafty garage." I looked at my sister, truly seeing the stranger she had become. She was perfectly willing to see me thrown onto the street if it meant securing the seed money for whatever superficial lifestyle she and Wade were currently chasing. At the mention of his name, Wade shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had always been the weakest link in their alliance, a man desperate for Reed's approval, but entirely lacking his sociopathic composure. As he adjusted his posture to avoid my gaze, his elbow knocked against a thick black leather portfolio he had rested against the leg of his chair. The portfolio tipped over, spilling a few glossy pages onto the edge of the dining room rug. Wade cursed under his breath and scrambled to gather them. In that brief, chaotic second, my trained eyes locked onto the bold, geometric logo printed across the top of the exposed folder, Blackwater Urban Holdings. I had never heard the name before, but the context provided an instantaneous, undeniable translation. This was the ghost buyer. This was the massive, anonymous corporate entity that had been quietly swallowing up every single lot, warehouse, and abandoned storefront on my street. They were the ones pulling the strings, dictating the aggressive timeline, and demanding the clear title to my carriage house. Reed was not the mastermind. He was merely an errand boy desperately trying to deliver the final piece of the puzzle to a much bigger predator before a strict corporate deadline expired. A violent, chaotic storm of rage and betrayal was screaming inside my chest, demanding that I stand up, flip the heavy oak table, and scream the truth in their faces. I wanted to tell Reed I knew the power of attorney was a fraudulent piece of garbage. I wanted to tell Lenora she could take her condominium and choke on it. I wanted to expose the entire, pathetic conspiracy right there over the roasted turkey and cranberry sauce, but I did not. My work in architectural preservation had taught me one vital, unyielding rule when dealing with hostile corporate takeovers: never show the enemy your blueprints until the foundation is already poured. If I exploded now, if I revealed exactly what I knew about the voided documents and the Blackwater connection, Reed would immediately pivot. He would call his lawyers tonight, He would manufacture new backdated documents. He would find a different, more secure angle of attack. I had to let them believe their ambush had worked flawlessly. I had to let them bask in their perceived victory so they would become sloppy. I deliberately slumped my shoulders. I let my hands drop limply into my lap, releasing the edges of the fraudulent quitclaim deed. I looked down at the polished wood of the table, fixing my face into a mask of stunned, defeated silence. I did not shed a tear, but I allowed my breathing to turn shallow and erratic, perfectly mimicking the physical response of a woman completely broken by her family's cruelty. The silence stretched, heavy and victorious. Reed looked at Lenora, a brief, microscopic nod passing between them. My father adjusted his cuffs, his posture relaxing even further. My silence was the exact currency he had been demanding. To a man who viewed every interaction as a transaction, my failure to immediately argue was the ultimate sign of submission. He firmly believed he had just successfully bullied me into surrendering the only thing I truly loved. He had absolutely no idea that my silence was not a surrender. It was the first move in a plan he could not even see. I pushed my chair back from the table, the wooden legs scraping harshly against the floorboards. The ringing of the doorbell had finally ceased, leaving a vibrating echo in the hallway. I walked away from the dining room, leaving my family to bask in their fabricated triumph. When I pulled the heavy oak front door open, the crisp autumn air rushed in, carrying the scent of dry leaves and wood smoke. Standing on my porch was Naomi Keene. Naomi was a woman in her late 60s who lived in the narrow, beautifully maintained brick house directly adjacent to my side alley. She had silver hair cut into a sharp, practical bob, and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. For 35 years, she had worked as a senior title examiner for the county clerk's office. She had spent her entire professional life hunting down discrepancies in property deeds, unearthing buried liens, and destroying fraudulent real estate transactions. She was retired now, but her mind remained a steel trap for legal technicalities. In her left hand, she held a warm sweet potato pie in a glass dish. In her right hand, she gripped a thick, heavily sealed manila envelope. "Happy Thanksgiving, Peyton," Naomi said, her voice perfectly even, betraying none of the typical holiday cheer. She looked past my shoulder, her sharp gaze piercing down the hallway toward the dining room where my family sat. "I saw your father's car parked illegally in the alleyway. I figured it was time." I did not need to ask what she meant. I stepped aside, letting her cross the threshold. When Naomi and I walked into the dining room, the atmosphere instantly hardened. Reed bristled, clearly irritated by the sudden intrusion of an outsider. He adjusted his collar, preparing to dismiss her with his usual polished arrogance. Lenora plastered on her most condescending, socially acceptable smile. Brenna and Wade simply stared, confused by the interruption. "We are in the middle of a private family discussion, Mrs. Keene," Reed stated, his tone dripping with false politeness. "Perhaps you could leave the pie in the kitchen and we can catch up another time." Naomi did not walk to the kitchen. She walked directly to the head of the long oak table. She set the sweet potato pie down right next to the fraudulent eviction notice my father had just served me. Then, she placed the heavy manila envelope squarely over my father's empty porcelain plate. The temperature in the room plummeted. Reed glared at the envelope, his annoyance instantly morphing into a sharp, calculating wariness. Even a man as arrogant as my father could recognize a tactical threat when it was placed directly in front of him. This was not a spontaneous, neighborly gesture. "I am afraid your family discussion is over." "Reed," Naomi said. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her authority filled the room, heavy and absolute. "Mabel gave me very specific instructions regarding this property." I looked down at the envelope. Across the front, written in Mabel's unmistakable, severe cursive handwriting, was a single, devastating sentence. "Deliver only if Reed ever tries to remove Peyton from this house." The blood slowly began to drain from my father's face. He recognized his aunt's handwriting instantly. He knew exactly how meticulous, how thoroughly uncompromising Mabel had been in life. Seeing her script reaching out from beyond the grave to intercept his plan was a blow he had not anticipated. "That woman has been dead for years," Reed scoffed, though his voice lacked its previous ironclad certainty. "Whatever sentimental garbage is in that envelope has absolutely no legal bearing on the current structural ownership of this holding." Naomi offered him a smile that was entirely devoid of warmth. It was the smile of an executioner who had just checked the sharpness of the blade. "Let us test that theory, shall we?" With methodical precision, Naomi broke the heavy wax seal on the back of the envelope. She reached inside and withdrew a stack of impeccably preserved legal documents. They were not flimsy copies. They carried the raised, embossed seals of the county clerk. She peeled the first document off the top and slid it across the polished mahogany, bringing it to rest right on top of my father's fake quitclaim deed. "Document 1, Naomi announced, her tone slipping effortlessly into the clinical cadence of a courtroom examiner. "A fully certified, notarized, and publicly recorded copy of the absolute revocation of your power of attorney. Mabel filed this exactly 2 years before she passed away. I personally walked her down to the records department to ensure it was entered into the primary ledger. It completely nullifies the authority you claimed when you signed that fraudulent transfer last week." Reed stared at the embossed seal. His jaw tightened, the muscles ticking erratically beneath his skin. He tried to swallow, but his throat appeared to have gone entirely dry. Naomi did not give him a single second to recover. She pulled the second document from the stack. It was thicker, bound with a blue legal cover. She dropped it next to the first with a heavy, satisfying thud. "Document 2, she continued, her eyes locking onto his paling face. "A comprehensive settlement and waiver agreement, signed and dated by you, Reed. Do you remember the autumn your secondary commercial roofing company was facing complete bankruptcy? Mabel bailed you out. She transferred $175,000 into your failing corporate account. In exchange, you signed this legally binding contract. It explicitly states that you surrender any and all future claims, rights, and interests in this specific carriage house, including the adjoining side alley. You signed away your rights to this dirt in exchange for cash." Lenora gasped softly, her perfect composure finally fracturing. She looked at Reed, her eyes wide with sudden panic. "Reed, what is she talking about?" "What roofing company?" He had kept the bailout a secret even from his own wife. Wade let out a low, nervous whistle, shrinking further back into his chair. Brenna looked completely terrified, her dreams of using my house to fund her lifestyle instantly vaporizing into thin air. "This is a private financial matter," Reed spat, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. He reached out to snatch the waiver off the table, but Naomi's hand shot out, her fingers pressing firmly down on the paper, anchoring it in place. "It was private," Naomi corrected him, her voice a low, dangerous purr. "Until you tried to steal a house that does not belong to you." She withdrew the third and final document from the envelope. It was a single, crisply typed letter on professional letterhead. "And finally, document 3, Naomi said, placing it gently on top of the pile. "This is a preemptive instruction letter that Mabel and I drafted together. We mailed certified copies to every major title insurance underwriting firm operating within this jurisdiction. It formally instructs them to immediately flag any transfer, sale, or lien placed on this property that originates from your defunct power of attorney as highly suspicious and potentially fraudulent." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of total, devastating defeat. Naomi had not just dismantled his current attack. She had revealed that his entire legal foundation was built on quicksand. He had walked into a meticulously designed trap that had been waiting for him for years. I stared at the papers, my heart pounding a fierce, triumphant rhythm against my ribs. The realization washed over me like a wave of pure, crystalline ice. Mabel had not just left me a beautiful, historic carriage house. She knew the exact nature of the predators swimming in my gene pool. She knew Reed would eventually come for the property, armed with aggressive lawyers and fabricated paperwork. So, she had spent her final years quietly building an impenetrable fortress around me. She had not just bequeathed me a home, she had engineered a flawless, lethal counterattack mechanism designed to detonate the exact moment my father tried to strip me of my sanctuary. Reed sat frozen at the head of the table. The man who had entered my home an hour ago exuding unstoppable corporate dominance was now reduced to a pale, sweating statue. His grand, invincible scheme to sell my home to an anonymous developer had just been completely dismantled by a retired clerk holding a sweet potato pie. He had brought a fabricated notice to vacate to a war, and he had just realized, far too late, that the barrel was pressed directly against his own forehead. Naomi adjusted her reading glasses, letting them rest on the bridge of her nose. She picked up the thick settlement agreement from the mahogany table, handling the paper with the practiced ease of a career bureaucrat. She did not raise her voice to match the soaring tension in the room. She spoke with a measured, deliberate cadence, reading the text as if she were reciting a final verdict. "Let us review Section 4, Paragraph B," Naomi began, her eyes scanning the dense legal font. "It dictates that should the debtor, Reed Whitfield, directly or indirectly interfere with Peyton Whitfield's right of ownership, title, or quiet enjoyment of the carriage house property, the entirety of the principal sum of $175,000 shall become immediately due and payable." She paused, letting the sheer weight of that massive financial penalty settle over the ruined Thanksgiving dinner. But she was not finished. "Furthermore," Naomi continued, her tone sharpening, "upon such interference, the executor of Mabel Whitfield's estate is hereby authorized and directed to freeze any and all pending or future distributions of liquid assets to the entire Reed Whitfield lineage until the debt is satisfied in full." Lenora slammed her hand flat onto the table. The sudden, violent impact sent the silver cutlery rattling sharply against the fine porcelain plates. The pristine, unbothered Southern Belle facade she had worn all evening completely shattered, revealing the raw, ugly panic beneath, her neck flushed an angry, blotchy red. "That is an absurd, malicious paper trap," Lenora hissed, pointing an accusing, trembling finger at my neighbor. "You two conspired with a dying woman to extort her own nephew. No judge in this state will uphold a secret contract designed purely out of spite." Naomi did not flinch. She slowly lowered the document, meeting my mother's furious glare with absolute, chilling composure. "Mabel did not build a trap, Lenora. She simply drafted a consequence tailored specifically for a thief. She did not write that clause out of spite. She wrote the law for the exact person who would inevitably try to break it." Reed, finally recovering from the initial, paralyzing shock of seeing his own signature weaponized against him, hastily straightened the lapels of his charcoal jacket. He leaned forward, bracing his forearms against the edge of the table, and forced his face into a mask of cold, pragmatic arrogance. He was bleeding out strategically, but he refused to concede the battlefield. "None of this matters," Reed declared, his voice dropping an octave to project a false sense of absolute authority. "You can wave those historical artifacts around all you want, Naomi. The undeniable fact remains that the new transfer deed is already stamped, scanned, and officially recorded in the county system. Undoing a recorded real estate deed requires a judge, a court docket, and months of grueling, expensive litigation. And we do not need months." He aggressively tapped his index finger against the fraudulent notice to vacate sitting next to the pie. "We only need days," Reed sneered, his eyes locking onto mine, entirely devoid of any paternal warmth. "By the time your lawyers even manage to draft the petition to correct the public record, the bulldozer will have already cleared this lot to the foundation, and the commercial wire transfer will be sitting securely in my holding account. The deal will be done. Peyton, you cannot unring the bell." Wade, who had been sweating profusely and shifting in his chair like a trapped animal, suddenly leaned forward, his voice cracking with sheer, unfiltered panic. "But Reed, if they manage to file an emergency injunction before closing Monday, the buyers will pull out entirely." The dining room instantly went dead silent. The heavy, stifling quiet was so absolute, I could hear the faint crackle of the wax candles burning in the chandelier. Wade realized his catastrophic mistake a fraction of a second too late. He clamped a hand over his mouth, his eyes wide with terror as he looked at my father. "Closing Monday," I repeated, the words tasting like bitter ash on my tongue. It was currently Thursday night. The holiday weekend meant all county offices were closed until the following week. They had less than 96 hours. The entire block's multi-million-dollar corporate buyout, the mysterious Blackwater Urban Holdings acquisition, was hinging entirely on closing this specific weekend. That was the brutal, inflexible deadline. They were trying to rush the demolition before the bureaucratic offices even opened their doors on Monday morning. Brenna bolted upright. Her chair tipped backward, crashing loudly onto the hardwood floor. She did not bother to pick it up. She whirled around, her face pale and contorted with sudden vicious realization, turning entirely on our father. "Wait," Brenna shrieked, her voice shrill and trembling with panic. "If that debt clause accelerates, and the estate freezes all the distributions, what about my boutique? You explicitly promised me the seed money from the Blackwater payout. You told me you were kicking her out so we could finally fund my store. If the money is frozen, Wade and I have absolutely nothing." The final ugly veil dropped, exposing the rotten core of the entire conspiracy. I looked at Brenna, hyperventilating in her expensive silk dress, and then at Reed, whose jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle twitched violently in his cheek. The profound sickness of their dynamic hit me with the force of a physical blow. My father had never intended to give Brenna a single dime. He had deliberately weaponized her greed to secure her silent complicity at this table. He had convinced his youngest daughter to happily watch her older sister become homeless under the grand, fabricated guise of funding her retail dreams. In reality, he needed the massive Blackwater payout solely to plug the massive, bleeding crater of his own collapsing corporate investments. He was perfectly willing to sacrifice both of his daughters to save himself. He traded one to the streets and the other to a lie, just to keep his own head above water. Before Reed could formulate a lie to pacify Brenna, Naomi delivered the final, fatal strike. "There will be no closing on Monday," Naomi stated. Her tone shifted from educational to terminal. "Because I did not just bring these documents to a Thanksgiving dinner party to argue with you. Yesterday afternoon, I hand-delivered a duplicate, fully indexed binder of this exact evidence to Cora Bell, the lead investigator at the County Real Estate Fraud Division." Reed's false composure shattered completely. His eyes widened, genuine fear finally breaking through his arrogant facade. "They are already fully aware that a fabricated deed was submitted to the clerk," Naomi continued, her voice echoing in the silent room. "If you attempt to enforce that eviction notice, or if you even think about sending a contractor to this address to secure the premises, it will not be a messy civil dispute over an inheritance. It will be a direct, criminal indictment for title fraud and forgery." Reed stood up so violently that his thigh caught the edge of the heavy oak table. His wineglass toppled over, sending a dark red tide of Merlot spilling across the pristine white linen tablecloth like a fresh, spreading wound. He did not look down at the ruin he had caused. He did not look at my mother, who was now staring at him in unblinking horror, realizing the true extent of his legal exposure. He did not look at Brenna, who was quietly sobbing against Wade's shoulder. He looked only at me. His eyes were completely hollow, trapped, and entirely dangerous. He was a predator backed into a corner, his primary escape route completely obliterated, furiously calculating the remaining desperate exits. "This is not over," Reed said, his voice reduced to a low, raspy threat that barely carried over the sound of my sister's crying. "Tomorrow, everything will be different." He turned on his heel and marched out of the dining room. He did not grab his coat. The heavy front door slammed shut a moment later, the violent impact vibrating the antique glass in the chandelier above my head. He was fleeing the house, cornered by his own hubris, but the absolute malice radiating from his final words proved he was not yet ready to surrender the war. The physical house was entirely silent, but the digital walls were actively closing in. After my family had finally fled, leaving behind the wreckage of our holiday dinner and the dark stain of spilled wine on the linen tablecloth, I did not go to sleep. I could not. The adrenaline in my bloodstream had crystallized into a cold, hyper-vigilant dread. I sat alone at the sprawling quartz island in my kitchen, the only illumination coming from the harsh, blue glow of my laptop screen. I knew Reed's final threat had not been empty. I knew him well enough to understand that was not an empty threat. Reed Whitfield did not retreat to lick his wounds. He retreated to coordinate a secondary strike. If the frontal assault utilizing a fabricated eviction notice and a fraudulent deed had been blocked by Naomi's brilliant countermaneuver, he would simply bypass the legal battlefield altogether. He would deploy his corporate machinery to erase me through the back channels. I refreshed my email inbox. I hit the button again and again. I sat there for hours, watching the digital clock in the corner of my screen slowly tick past midnight, then 1, then 2 in the morning. I felt as though the entire bureaucratic world was silently crawling beneath the weather stripping of my heavy oak door. At exactly 5:45 in the morning, the first invisible blow landed. A high-priority notification chimed from my phone. It was an automated message from the regional gas and electric utility provider. I opened the email, my eyes scanning the sterile corporate font. The subject line read, "Service transfer request received." The body of the text coldly informed me that a formal request had been submitted to disconnect the primary utility account registered in my name and transfer the billing and service control to a commercial entity listed as Blackwater Site Services. The effective date for the grid transfer was set for the very next day. They were not just trying to take the title, they were actively moving to shut off my lights and freeze the pipes. 10 minutes later, before I could even draft a frantic dispute to the utility company, a second email arrived. This one was from the United States Postal Service. My daily Informed Delivery Digest contained an emergency administrative alert. Someone had submitted a permanent change of address and mail forwarding request for my specific residential parcel. All future correspondence, including bills, legal notices, and personal letters, was being automatically rerouted to a commercial post office box located 3 counties away. They were systematically cutting my communication lines. They were blinding me. The most terrifying notification arrived precisely at 6 in the morning. It was an automated text message from the City Municipal Code Enforcement Division. The message stated that a formal, anonymous complaint had been registered overnight regarding my property. The official status of my home had been forcefully updated in the city database. The exact administrative tags attached to my address were chilling vacant, unsecured, and structurally neglected. The true, horrifying architecture of their strategy finally clicked into place. If my father and his anonymous corporate backers could not immediately evict me through a legitimate court order, they would simply manufacture an alternative reality. They were aggressively building a fabricated paper trail to reclassify my carriage house as an abandoned, derelict structure. If the city believed the property was empty, and the utility companies believed a demolition crew had taken over the site services, then I was no longer a legal resident defending her home. Under the eyes of the municipal system, I would be instantly transformed into a nameless squatter trespassing in a vacant commercial lot. I picked up my phone and immediately dialed Naomi. I knew she was awake. Women who spent 3 decades hunting property fraud did not sleep when a rigged transaction was actively unfolding next door. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was raspy but entirely alert. "What are they doing? Peyton?" "They are trying to turn me into a ghost," I said, my voice barely above a whisper in the echoing kitchen. "They submitted requests to transfer my electricity to Blackwater. They rerouted my mail to an off-site commercial box. The city code enforcement just flagged this entire property as vacant and unsecured. It is a classic bureaucratic takedown," Naomi replied, her tone hardening with professional disgust. "This is the exact playbook for dirty commercial redevelopment operations. They cannot win the argument on the merits of the deed, so they create a massive flood of fake paperwork regarding the physical status of the house. They use those fake utility requests and code violations to justify sending in a private security or contracting firm to take absolute physical control of the structure. They secure the perimeter, change the deadbolts, and suddenly you are the one standing on the sidewalk trying to prove you live there. "What do I do?" I asked, looking around the kitchen I had meticulously restored with my own hands. "You document your existence," Naomi instructed sharply. "You flood the counter-narrative. The only way to fight a paper lie is with irrefutable, time-stamped reality. Take your camera. Walk through every single room. Prove you are breathing the air inside that house." I ended the call and switched my phone to the video recording application. I took a deep, steadying breath and began to build my fortress of evidence. I started in the kitchen. I made sure the digital timestamp was clearly visible on the recording. I opened the heavy stainless steel door of the refrigerator, filming the massive, foil-wrapped Thanksgiving turkey sitting on the middle shelf next to a carton of milk and fresh vegetables. I turned the brass faucet on the farmhouse sink, capturing the clear water running smoothly into the drain. I filmed my laptop glowing brightly on the quartz island, surrounded by a stack of recent mail securely addressed to me at this specific location. I walked slowly into the living room, leaving a trail of turning lights in my wake. I recorded the warmth radiating from the cast iron radiator. I zoomed in on my favorite pair of worn leather boots, sitting casually by the front door. I filmed the expensive, delicate glass ornaments hanging perfectly from the large potted indoor ficus tree. I moved upstairs to my bedroom, capturing the unmade sheets, the clothes hanging neatly in the mahogany wardrobe, and the alarm clock glowing softly on the nightstand. I was not a ghost. I was a living, breathing woman occupying a fully functional, fiercely loved home. I took over 200 photographs and recorded 15 minutes of undeniable, high-definition proof of my residency. I sat back down at the kitchen island, the cold quartz grounding me as I prepared for the final, most crucial step of the night. I opened my professional email client. I needed to bypass the automated systems entirely and reach a human being with the authority to freeze this manufactured bureaucratic nightmare. I began drafting an urgent, highly detailed email to Cora Bell. Cora was not just an acquaintance. She was the senior investigator for the County Land Fraud Division. I had worked closely with her 2 years ago when Meridian Arc Preservation was fighting to save a historic theater from a corrupt developer who had attempted a very similar fraudulent transfer tactic. Cora was ruthless, incredibly intelligent, and she despised predatory real estate schemes more than anyone I had ever met. Naomi had already primed her with the initial binder of evidence yesterday afternoon, but Cora needed to see the real-time escalation. I typed out the exact timeline of the automated notifications. I attached the screenshots of the Blackwater utility transfer request and the fraudulent postal forwarding confirmation. I attached the city code enforcement text message falsely labeling my home as a vacant structure. Finally, I uploaded the video file I had just recorded, the absolute proof that the property was occupied, secured, and meticulously maintained. I pressed send exactly at 6:45 in the morning. The sun was just beginning to cast a weak gray light through the tall, leaded glass windows of my kitchen. The night of invisible maneuvers was over. I closed my laptop, walked into the hallway, and firmly locked the deadbolt on the heavy oak front door. They had spent the entire night building a paper cage around my house. I knew, with absolute certainty, that they would soon send someone in person to test the locks. The heavy oak door had been locked for exactly 45 minutes when the rumble of heavy engines vibrated through the floorboards of my front hallway. I did not flinch. I walked deliberately to the tall, leaded glass window framing the entryway and pulled back the heavy linen curtain. 3 distinct vehicles were idling aggressively along the curb, blocking the narrow access to the side alley. The first was a battered white panel truck bearing a magnetic sign slapped haphazardly across its side doors. The bold block letters read, "Vacant Property Management and Site Security." The second vehicle was a stark contrast, a pristine, aggressively tinted black SUV. The third was a small, rusted utility van with a commercial locksmith logo painted on the back window. They did not bring sheriff deputies. They did not bring court-ordered bailiffs or a judge's mandate. My father was far too cowardly to attach his own face to this physical invasion. Reed had chosen to hide comfortably behind the sterile, anonymous machinery of corporate subcontractors. He was using the suffocating weight of administrative procedure to legitimize the theft, sending strangers with clipboards to do his dirty work. 4 men stepped onto the damp cobblestone walkway. 2 men wore heavy canvas work jackets and carried thick metal toolboxes. One held a roll of bright, neon orange heavy-duty adhesive tape, the kind used to seal condemned doors. The 3rd man was clearly the locksmith, a ring of heavy brass keys and a cordless drill hanging from his utility belt. The 4th man was entirely out of place. He wore a sharp, expensive navy blue suit and highly polished leather Oxfords that immediately scuffed against the uneven historic brickwork. He gripped a thick, leather-bound portfolio tightly against his chest. I knew instantly he was the representative from Blackwater Urban Holdings. I did not wait for them to reach the porch. I did not let them ring the bell. I turned the heavy brass deadbolt, gripped the iron handle, and threw the door wide open. I stepped out onto the threshold, planting my boots firmly onto the top step. The crisp morning air hit my face, but I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, burning focus. Under my left arm, I held a thick, red plastic folder containing my original deed, the stack of utility bills, and the hard copies of the time-stamped photographs I had taken only an hour prior. The 4 men froze at the base of the stairs. They had clearly been briefed to expect a dark, empty shell. They were entirely unprepared to find a furious, fully awake woman standing guard over a brightly lit hallway smelling of fresh coffee and roasted turkey. The man holding the neon orange tape cleared his throat, glancing nervously at the clipboard in his hand. "Ma'am," he began, his voice taking on the practiced, detached drone of a low-level enforcer. "We have a work order to secure an apparently abandoned structure at this address. We need you to step aside so we can change the exterior locks and properly winterize the interior plumbing systems. You are currently trespassing on private property," I stated, my voice ringing out sharp and clear in the quiet neighborhood. "This structure is not abandoned. It is not vacant. It is my primary residence, and I am denying you entry." The man in the navy suit stepped forward, holding up a hand to pause the contractors. His eyes darted nervously past my shoulder, taking in the antique chandelier casting a warm glow over the polished hardwood floors. He looked down at the file in his hands, then back up at me, a deep frown creasing his forehead. "My name is Evan Sutter," he said, his tone slick but undeniably defensive. "I am a senior acquisitions director for Blackwater Urban Holdings. We have legally binding documentation explicitly stating that this property has been fully surrendered by the previous estate and is currently unoccupied. We have an authorized mandate from the legal title holder, Whitfield Family Holdings, to take immediate physical possession of the asset this morning. Your mandate is built on a forgery. Mr. Sutter," I replied, not yielding a single inch of the porch. "My father, Reed Whitfield, lied to you. He lied to your corporate board, and he fabricated the documents you are holding." Evan Sutter stiffened, his professional veneer cracking slightly. "That is a very serious and highly actionable accusation to make out on the street. Ma'am, we have a stamped, recorded quitclaim deed transferring the title. We have the utility shut-off notices. We are fully within our legal rights to proceed with the site preservation protocol." "Then proceed." A new, sharp voice cut through the damp morning air. "But I highly recommend you have your corporate counsel on speed dial before you drill that lock." Everyone turned toward the sidewalk. Naomi Keene was marching up the cobblestone path, her posture perfectly rigid, her eyes burning with the righteous fury of a seasoned bureaucrat. Right beside her walked a woman I recognized instantly. Cora Bell did not look like a typical county investigator. She wore a heavy practical wool coat over dark jeans, and her dark hair was pulled back into a severe, uncompromising knot. She carried a sleek silver briefcase and an aura of absolute terrifying authority. "Who are you?" Evan Sutter demanded, taking a half-step backward as the two women approached the base of the stairs. Cora did not answer him immediately. She calmly reached into her coat pocket, withdrew a leather wallet, and flipped it open to display a heavy silver badge. Cora Bell, lead investigator, County Real Estate Fraud Division. You are currently attempting to execute a hostile property takeover based on a contested, potentially criminal title transfer. The two contractors carrying the toolboxes immediately took a massive step away from the door. The locksmith instinctively dropped his hand away from his heavy cordless drill. They were paid hourly to board up empty houses. They were absolutely not paid to participate in a felony fraud investigation. "This is ridiculous," Evan sputtered. Though his face was rapidly draining of color, he clutched his leather portfolio tighter. "We conducted a standard, accelerated title search. We have the recorded deed from Reed Whitfield right here." "Show it to me," Cora demanded. Holding out her hand, it was not a request. Evan hesitated for exactly 2 seconds before pulling a crisp, white copy of the quitclaim deed from his folder and handing it over. Cora took the document. Naomi stepped up beside her, pulling the certified copy of Mabel's power of attorney revocation from her own pocket. Cora placed the two documents side by side against the surface of her silver briefcase. The crisp morning sunlight illuminated the dense blocks of legal text. I watched her eyes dart back and forth, cross-referencing the signatures, the filing dates, and the county clerk stamps. The tension on the front lawn was suffocating. The idling engine of the white panel truck was the only sound in the dead quiet of the street. Suddenly, Cora let out a short, humorless laugh. She shook her head, tapping a perfectly manicured fingernail against the bottom corner of the fraudulent deed my father had provided to Blackwater. "Reed Whitfield is either incredibly desperate or aggressively stupid," Cora announced, looking directly at Evan Sutter. "Look at the notary public authentication block at the bottom of the signature page." Evan leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he read the small, fine print. "The notary seal utilized to authenticate this property transfer belongs to a man named Arthur Vance," Cora explained, her voice ringing with lethal precision. "Mr. Vance is a private notary often employed by Whitfield Family Holdings. However, if you look at the unique commission code printed beneath the stamp and cross-reference it with the state licensing database, you will discover a rather massive, unavoidable problem." Cora looked up, her gaze locking onto Evan's terrified face. "Arthur Vance's state notary commission officially expired on the 14th of September. This deed was allegedly signed and stamped on the 22nd of November. The seal is completely invalid. The authentication is legally void. This document is a fraudulent instrument." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. The legal trap my father had so desperately constructed had just spectacularly collapsed under the weight of one tiny, overlooked administrative detail. "Pack it up," the lead contractor suddenly barked. He turned sharply, waving at his crew. "We are leaving right now. Put the tape back in the truck. I am not losing my business license over a fake deed." The locksmith did not say a single word. He practically sprinted back to his rusted van, throwing his tools into the back and slamming the doors shut. Within 60 seconds, the white panel truck and the utility van had sped away down the street, leaving the Blackwater representative entirely alone on the sidewalk. Evan Sutter looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on a landmine. He looked down at the forged paper in his hands, then up at Cora Bell's silver badge, and finally at me, standing resolutely on my porch. The arrogant corporate swagger had completely vanished. The entire atmosphere of the confrontation had violently shifted. They had arrived with clipboards and arrogant demands, expecting a smooth, unopposed property seizure. They had expected to sweep me out like dust. Now, standing in the cold light of day, the illusion of a legitimate administrative procedure was completely shattered. This was no longer a corporate takeover. This was no longer a routine property dispute. It had become a criminal investigation, and Blackwater Urban Holdings was standing in the middle of it, Evan Sutter practically sprinted back to his black SUV. He did not drive away immediately. He locked the heavy doors and pressed his cell phone tightly to his ear, his face a mask of absolute, sweating panic. While the Blackwater representative frantically sought guidance from his corporate superiors, I led Naomi and Cora away from the front porch and around the perimeter of the brick exterior toward the narrow side alleyway. I pulled my smartphone from my coat pocket and opened the security application linking to the discreet, motion-activated camera I had mounted beneath the heavy wooden eaves last year. If my father had orchestrated a massive administrative lie, he would desperately need physical staging to back it up when the city inspectors inevitably arrived. I scrolled quickly through the digital timeline. I found the exact spike in recorded activity. The timestamp read exactly 4:12 in the morning. The grainy black and white infrared footage revealed a figure creeping down my cobblestone path. It was Wade Kessler. My brother-in-law was hunched over, moving with the jerky, terrified franticness of a man who knew he was actively committing a crime. He was carrying a stack of thick envelopes secured with a rubber band and 2 large cardboard boxes. In the video, Wade dropped the envelopes directly onto the welcome mat of my secondary entrance. He then stacked the boxes against the brick wall, across the side of the top box. The words "site staging" were written in thick, sloppy black marker. I walked down the alleyway in real life, my boots crunching softly on the damp autumn leaves. The envelopes were exactly where Wade had left them. I picked them up, examining the printed labels. They were addressed to an entity called Apex Structural Demolition, mailed to my exact residential address. It was completely fabricated mail, designed specifically to support the fraudulent postal change of address my father had submitted. I turned my attention to the small exterior storage closet tucked beneath the slope of the wooden back staircase. The rusted iron latch had been recently forced open. I pulled the small wooden door wide. Inside, shoved carelessly onto the dusty shelves, was a haphazard collection of theatrical props. There were heavy bundles of cheap, dark blackout curtains, the exact kind used to seal up windows from the inside to make a house look completely uninhabited from the street. There were bright yellow plastic signs bearing bold black lettering that read, "Restricted Site Access and Active Construction Zone." Sitting on top of the curtains was a fake carbon copy receipt book, filled out with forged signatures, meant to definitively prove that a contracting crew had already taken physical possession of the interior. Wade had not just been playing the silent errand boy. He had been an active, willing participant in building the physical illusion that my home was a dead, empty shell waiting for the wrecking ball. Cora stepped into the cramped alleyway, her silver briefcase balanced expertly against her hip. She had her own secure county tablet open, the screen glowing brightly in the shadows of the historic carriage house. "Your father did not just forge the deed. Peyton," Cora said, her voice dropping into a register of pure, analytical coldness. "He tried to build a secondary layer of legal insulation just in case the county clerk caught the expired notary stamp." She handed the glowing tablet to Naomi. "Look at the supplemental filing submitted to the probate division 2 days ago." Naomi adjusted her reading glasses and peered at the screen. She let out a sharp, entirely humorless bark of laughter. "He filed a declaration officially assuming the role of temporary estate asset manager. That authority was permanently terminated the moment Mabel died," I stated, the sheer blinding stupidity of the move baffling me. "Of course it was," Naomi agreed, swiping her finger across the digital document. "But look at the specific legal phrasing he utilized in paragraph 3. He copied this word for word from a highly specialized probate template. I know this exact template because Reed came into my office exactly 7 years ago asking me how to deploy it during a different corporate bankruptcy. He never actually understood the jurisdictional prerequisites for this specific form. He simply memorized the legal jargon and pasted it onto a new document, hoping the sheer density of the vocabulary would intimidate a lower-level municipal clerk into rubber stamping it. It was a breathtakingly arrogant and incredibly sloppy strategy. He was actively building a house of paper cards in the middle of a legal hurricane. Heavy footsteps echoed at the far end of the alleyway. Evan Sutter stood at the entrance, his expensive navy suit looking suddenly wrinkled and disheveled. He was no longer holding his leather portfolio with aggressive corporate pride. He let it hang loosely at his side, his shoulders slumped. The phone call with his corporate superiors had clearly not gone well. "The title insurance underwriters just flagged the entire commercial project," Evan said, his voice completely hollow and defeated. He looked at Cora's silver badge, then at the fake construction mail clutched in my hand. The absolute reality of his situation had entirely crushed him. He was no longer a predatory corporate buyer. He was the primary victim of a massive, multi-million-dollar fraud scheme, and he was currently standing directly at the scene of the crime. "Start talking, Mr. Sutter," Cora commanded, stepping forward. "What exactly did Reed Whitfield promise your board of directors?" Evan swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "He guaranteed us completely vacant possession by the holiday weekend. He explicitly stated in writing that the sole remaining resident had already voluntarily surrendered the keys and vacated the premises months ago. And in exchange for that highly accelerated timeline," Cora pressed, her eyes narrowing with sharp suspicion, "Blackwater Urban Holdings does not just buy targeted properties blindly without a standard inspection period. We advanced capital," Evan confessed, the words clearly tasting like poison in his mouth. "Reed claimed he needed immediate, liquid cash to clear a series of obscure municipal liens attached to the property before he could legally transfer the clean title. Our board authorized a preliminary wire transfer of $250,000 yesterday morning to explicitly cover the site preparation and lien clearing fees." Cora closed her tablet with a sharp, definitive snap. "There are absolutely no municipal liens on this property. Mr. Sutter, I meticulously checked the county ledger myself this morning." The final, massive puzzle piece slammed into place with sickening clarity. The entire elaborate scheme, the fake eviction notice at the dinner table, the forged quitclaim deed, the administrative ghosting, the nighttime staging by Wade. None of it was actually about selling the carriage house to eventually fund Brenna's boutique. None of it was even about securing the final multi-million-dollar closing payout. It was entirely about the cash advance. My father's secondary investment firm was bleeding out. He had likely been hit with massive, catastrophic margin calls he could not cover. He was staring directly down the barrel of total, public financial ruin. He desperately needed an immediate, massive injection of cash just to survive the week. So, he fabricated a real estate deal, offered up my home as the collateral, and explicitly lied to a massive corporate developer to secure $250,000 in non-refundable advance fees. He took the Blackwater money and instantly diverted it to pay his own personal corporate debts. He had stolen the advance money before the deal even officially closed, banking entirely on his perceived ability to aggressively force me out onto the street before Blackwater realized they had been sold a massive lie. The profound realization did not bring hot, fiery anger. It brought a terrible, freezing cold that settled deep into my bones. I looked at the cheap blackout curtains Wade had shoved into my storage closet. I thought about the Thanksgiving dinner table, where my father had sat radiating absolute patriarchal authority while actively destroying my life just to cover his own pathetic financial gambling. For my entire adult life, I had assumed my father's obvious favoritism toward Brenna and his constant disdain for me were rooted in simple personality clashes or differing personal values. I had believed he possessed a twisted, toxic form of family loyalty that simply excluded me. But standing in the damp alleyway, staring at the irrefutable physical evidence of his absolute betrayal, the brutal truth stripped away all my lingering illusions. Reed Whitfield did not actually care about the family legacy. He did not care about Brenna's future. He cared only about maintaining his own hollow, gilded existence. He was a complete parasite, perfectly willing to devour the only secure foundation his oldest daughter had ever built, just to ensure he could continue living comfortably on the stolen money of other people. I looked at Cora and Naomi. The initial shock was entirely gone, replaced by a terrifying, surgical focus. "What is the exact next step?" I asked. my voice as hard and unyielding as the historic brick walls surrounding us. Because I am absolutely not going to simply wait here for him to try again. Cora Bell did not advise me to immediately march down to the county courthouse and file a massive, reactive civil lawsuit. We stood in the damp alleyway, the morning air still sharp and cold, as she outlined a far more lethal strategy. If you file a standard civil claim today, Cora explained, her voice dropping into a low, analytical register, your father will simply hire 5 aggressive defense attorneys to tie you up in endless procedural motions for the next 2 years. He will use his remaining corporate liquidity to bleed your personal finances entirely dry before you even see the inside of a courtroom. You do not strike a man like Reed on a legal battlefield he already knows how to manipulate. You strike him where he has absolutely no defensive perimeter. You strike the commercial transaction directly. She informed me that Blackwater Urban Holdings, the primary county title insurance underwriters, and the Municipal Zoning Board had scheduled a mandatory emergency convergence for Monday morning at exactly 9 o'clock. It was the final, high-stakes clearance meeting designed to officially authorize the block acquisition and release the escrow funds. Do not fight him in the shadows, Cora instructed, her dark eyes completely unyielding. Bring the entire chronological nightmare to that specific table. You cut the head off the snake right in front of its own corporate board. My phone began to vibrate relentlessly against the quartz island the moment I walked back inside my kitchen. It was Reed. He called 6 times before noon. When he finally realized I was completely ignoring his incoming calls, he resorted to leaving lengthy voice messages. His tone had entirely shifted from the aggressive, cornered predator who had fled my dining room the previous night. He sounded almost casually dismissive, seamlessly adopting the practiced, steady cadence of a benevolent patriarch attempting to manage a minor, highly emotional misunderstanding. He softly suggested that if I simply dropped my ridiculous resistance to the transition, he could personally secure a modest, private financial payout for me to help with moving expenses. He actually believed the sheer, ingrained pressure of our fractured family dynamic would eventually force me to quietly accept a few $1,000s and disappear. He thought I was still playing a juvenile game of emotional chicken. He had absolutely no idea I was actively building an execution block. Naomi Keene essentially moved into my kitchen for the next 48 hours. We cleared away the ruined Thanksgiving centerpieces, the spilled wine, and transformed the long, heavy oak dining table into a tactical war room. We meticulously arranged every single piece of documentary evidence into a chronological, undeniable timeline of premeditated corporate fraud. We anchored the timeline with Mabel's officially recorded revocation of the power of attorney. Next to it, we placed the signed settlement agreement explicitly proving Reed had surrendered all property rights for $175,000. Then came the newly forged transfer deed, highlighted with bright yellow marker to expose the expired notary commission code. We continued to build the snare, layering the physical table with the digital utility transfer requests, the Postal Service mail forwarding mandate, and the fabricated municipal code enforcement vacancy reports. Finally, we loaded a flash drive with the high-definition infrared security footage of Wade Kessler planting the theatrical construction props at 4 a.m. It was a perfectly clean, inescapable, and legally binding narrative. I did not even have to hunt for the remaining missing pieces of the conspiracy. They were handed directly to me by the very people my father had so casually manipulated. Late Saturday evening, a secure encrypted email arrived from Evan Sutter. The Blackwater Acquisitions Director was desperately trying to insulate his own career from the impending criminal fallout. To save himself, he secretly forwarded a direct communication Reed had sent to the Blackwater Executive Board exactly 3 weeks prior. In the attached message, my father explicitly, arrogantly promised to deliver my historic carriage house entirely empty and uncontested before the conclusion of the Thanksgiving holiday weekend. It was the absolute, undeniable proof of his premeditated, fraudulent timeline. The most surprising and devastating defection, however, came on Sunday afternoon. My phone chimed with a rapid, continuous succession of text messages. It was my sister, Brenna. She did not offer a tearful apology. She did not ask for my forgiveness for sitting silently at my table while they tried to steal my home. Instead, she silently delivered the final, rusted nails for our father's coffin. She sent a dozen high-resolution screenshots of direct text conversations between Reed and her husband. The messages explicitly showed our father ordering Wade to purchase the fake construction signs, secure the cheap blackout curtains, and plant the fabricated demolition mail in the alleyway. Brenna had finally realized she was never going to get the seed money for her fashion boutique. She had finally realized she was merely another disposable shield in his desperate financial shell game, and she chose to burn his entire operation to the ground before he could ruin her husband's life with a felony trespassing charge. Lenora made one final, desperate attempt to control the narrative on Sunday evening. She called me from her private cell phone, her voice dripping with the familiar, weaponized softness she had always used to smooth over every ugly family reality. "Peyton, darling," my mother cooed, entirely ignoring the absolute devastation they had attempted to unleash upon me. "Please be entirely reasonable about this situation. Do not march into some public municipal meeting tomorrow and turn this unfortunate internal family disagreement into a public scandal. It would be entirely devastating for your father's professional reputation. We can handle this privately. We can sit down like adults and negotiate a proper, generous settlement entirely off the public record." "There are no off-the-record negotiations, Mother," I replied, my voice completely devoid of any anger or sorrow, possessing only an absolute, freezing finality. "And the pristine reputation you are so desperately trying to protect was entirely fabricated to begin with." I hung up the phone without waiting for her response and permanently blocked her number from my device. Before I finally went upstairs to attempt to sleep on Sunday night, I sat alone in the dim, quiet light of the kitchen. I began carefully sliding the certified county documents back into the heavy manila envelope Naomi had brought over. As I reached deep inside the thick paper pocket to ensure the settlement waiver was securely tucked away, my fingertips brushed against something small and slightly textured wedged deep into the bottom corner. I pulled it out. It was a small, tightly folded piece of personal stationery. It was a final, handwritten note from Mabel that I had completely missed reading during the blinding chaos of Thursday night. I carefully unfolded the crisp, cream-colored paper and read the severe, elegant, cursive handwriting under the glow of the pendant light. I read the 2 short paragraphs twice, my breath catching sharply in my throat as the sheer, terrifying brilliance of my great-aunt's foresight hit me. She had not just built a legal wall around my house. She had left behind a financial trap designed to ruin anyone who tried to breach it. I carefully refolded the paper and slipped it securely into the interior silk breast pocket of the tailored charcoal blazer I planned to wear the next day. The following morning, the sky over the city was a brilliant, unforgiving, and cloudless blue. I walked up the wide, sweeping concrete steps of the downtown municipal building at exactly 8:45 in the morning. I did not feel the crushing, suffocating anxiety my family had always relied upon to keep me silent and compliant. I felt a cold, soaring sense of absolute tactical control. I gripped the thick leather handle of my briefcase, knowing it held the complete, chronological destruction of Reed Whitfield. But as I approached the heavy, frosted glass doors of the primary executive conference room, my hand brushed lightly against the lapel of my jacket, feeling the slight, hidden bulge of Mabel's final note. I was walking into the most important legal confrontation of my entire life holding a final, devastating trump card that absolutely no one else in the world knew existed. The municipal conference room on the 3rd floor of the county annex building smelled of stale coffee, industrial floor wax, and the stale tension of a corporate standoff. The long mahogany table was surrounded by heavy leather chairs, occupied by the people who held the power to either finalize the destruction of my home or halt it entirely. My father, Reed, sat directly across from me. He leaned back in his chair, his hands steepled casually beneath his chin. Wearing his expensive charcoal suit like a suit of armor, he looked entirely unbothered. He believed he was walking into a routine administrative rubber stamp session. He opened the emergency meeting exactly as he had managed every single conflict in our family for decades, by confidently attempting to control the entire narrative. He spoke in a calm, deeply patronizing tone, painting me as a hysterical, overly emotional daughter who was stubbornly standing in the way of logical commercial progress. My daughter has an unfortunate, deeply sentimental attachment to a decaying structure, Reed told the room, offering a tight, sympathetic smile to the title insurance underwriter and the city zoning representative. But as the sole legal representative of the estate, I can assure you the property is fully vacant and structurally compromised. Blackwater Urban Holdings acted entirely on the accurate, legally binding paperwork I provided to them. This delay is merely a minor internal family dispute over an inevitable commercial transition. We are ready to finalize the transfer today. I did not interrupt him. I did not raise my voice or pound my fists on the table. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the polished mahogany surface. I let him repeat his lies into the official administrative record. I let him confidently claim his absolute authority in front of the very people he had defrauded. When he finally finished his monologue, the room fell into a quiet, expectant silence. That was exactly when Cora Bell reached over and unlatched her silver briefcase. "Mr. Whitfield," Cora said, her voice cutting through the stale air like a frozen scalpel. She slid a thick, heavily tabbed file across the table, stopping it directly in front of the lead title insurance underwriter. "You are not the legal representative of anything. Furthermore, the transfer deed you filed with the county clerk last week is a blatantly fraudulent instrument. The notary commission utilized to stamp that specific document officially expired on the 14th of September, which is over 2 months before the alleged signing took place." Reed's confident posture instantly fractured. His hands dropped to the table, his knuckles turning white. He opened his mouth to formulate an excuse, but Naomi Keene did not give him a single second to breathe. Naomi stood up, her posture radiating decades of bureaucratic authority. She placed the certified revocation of the power of attorney and the heavily documented settlement waiver right in the center of the table. "Mabel revoked your authority 6 years ago," Naomi stated, her eyes locking onto my father. "And you explicitly signed away all rights, claims, and interests to that specific carriage house in exchange for a $175,000 corporate bailout. You have absolutely zero legal standing to sell a single brick of that property." The title insurance underwriter turned entirely pale. He flipped rapidly through the verified documents, then snapped his head toward Evan Sutter. Evan was sweating profusely, his expensive navy suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too big, desperate to insulate his own career from the impending criminal fallout. Evan did not hesitate to throw my father directly to the wolves. "He lied to our board of directors," Evan admitted to the room, his voice shaking with panic. "He guaranteed us completely vacant possession by the holiday weekend. We advanced his holding company $250,000 in site preparation and legal clearance fees, based on the explicit, written guarantee that the house was legally empty and uncontested. It was never empty," I finally spoke, my voice calm, level, and entirely devastating. I reached into my leather portfolio and pulled out the thick stack of printed text messages Brenna had sent me the previous night. I slid the glossy pages down the table toward the city zoning representative. And to cover up that massive financial lie, my father explicitly ordered his son-in-law to stage a fake demolition site at 4 a.m, entirely to fool the city code inspectors into generating a fraudulent vacancy report. The zoning official picked up the printed screenshots. His face reddened with immediate, profound anger as he read the coordinated, premeditated plan to manipulate his municipal department. The room was actively spinning out of Reed's control. The carefully constructed walls of his corporate illusion were collapsing directly on top of him. Yet, he still tried to mentally calculate a final escape route. I could see his eyes darting toward the door. He likely thought he could simply dissolve his holding company, declare bankruptcy, and walk away from the wreckage, leaving everyone else to sort out the mess. He did not know about the final piece of paper tucked securely inside the breast pocket of my blazer. I slowly reached into my jacket and withdrew the small, folded stationery. "Before she passed away," I said, looking directly into my father's wide, panicked eyes. Mabel anticipated exactly what kind of desperate maneuvers you would eventually try to pull. She left one final, binding instruction for the executor of her estate. I unfolded the cream paper and read her elegant, severe handwriting aloud to the silent room. Should Reed Whitfield ever attempt to utilize the carriage house property in any commercial redevelopment scheme, or interfere with Peyton Whitfield's ownership, the prior debt shall be accelerated immediately. Furthermore, the estate is legally authorized to immediately foreclose upon the designated collateral attached to that specific debt. I lowered the paper and looked at him. The silence in the room was absolute, suffocating, and beautiful. The collateral, as listed in the original private ledger Mabel kept, is your entire remaining commercial antique inventory and the primary warehouse that holds it. You did not just lose my house today. Reed, by triggering this clause, you just legally forfeited everything you own. The dominoes fell with brutal, spectacular administrative efficiency. The lead title insurer stood up and formally, verbally withdrew all coverage policies for the entire block acquisition on the spot. The city zoning representative immediately dismissed the vacant property citation from the public record and loudly stated that the municipal board would be initiating a full review of Reed's active business licenses. Blackwater's corporate counsel, sitting completely rigid next to Evan, coldly announced they were permanently terminating the acquisition contract and immediately filing a massive civil lawsuit against Reed for the full restitution of their advanced funds. As collateral damage to instantly cut their own liability, Blackwater formally terminated Wade's independent contracting agreements with their firm, severing him completely from their payroll. Lenora sat in the gallery chairs at the back of the room, her pristine composure entirely shattered. She was completely unable to spin a polite, socially acceptable Southern narrative out of a massive, undeniably public fraud. Brenna, sitting beside her, buried her face in her hands. She was finally forced to confront the devastating reality that she had married a weak, compliant man who had been trained to be a criminal by her own father, and that her promised boutique money had never actually existed. Reed was completely trapped. He was stripped of his authority, stripped of his assets, and drowning in a sea of his own fraudulent paperwork. There was no aggressive corporate maneuver left to save him. Several weeks passed. The aggressive commercial developers fully retreated from Old Louisville, their massive luxury project entirely paralyzed by the loss of the central alleyway. I kept the carriage house. I kept the cobblestone path. I kept every single right attached to the dirt beneath my boots, with the immediate, suffocating threat permanently eradicated. I finally began the project I had dreamed about for years. I hired a specialized crew, and we converted the entire upper loft of the carriage house into a sprawling, sunlit architectural preservation studio and historical archive. I named it after Mabel. On a quiet Tuesday evening, I stood alone in my dining room. The antique chandelier cast a warm, familiar glow over the heavy oak table. I opened the top drawer of the antique mahogany sideboard, the one lined with soft, dark green felt. I placed the original, fabricated notice to vacate inside, resting it gently against the velvet. I did not keep it to remember the profound betrayal, or to dwell on the pain of that ruined Thanksgiving dinner. I kept it as a permanent, physical reminder of a very specific, hard-earned truth. Paper is a terrifying weapon in the hands of a predator, but if you know exactly how to read the fine print, you can turn the blade around and let it seamlessly cut the very hand that tried to destroy you. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please leave a comment down below and let me know where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.